Hi, how's it going? This is Resident of Collinwood for YouTube. I'm here to do my read along for the Dark Shadows Daybook Unbound, written by Patrick McCrae. Introduction: A Morbid Child by Mark B. Perry. When I was in third grade, I was bitten by a vampire, figuratively, of course, and I happened to be crossing through the den where my big sister was glued to our Vilco. There, a monochromatic and maniacal young man was prying open a chained casket in a creepy mausoleum. Big Sis, her eyes never leaving the tube, explained that his name was Willie Loomis, and he was looking to do a little grave robbing. She'd barely finished her sentence when both of us gasped in unison. Gobsmacked. You all know that moment, that image, that dawn of a brand new vampire trope in all of its face quacking, flesh quivering terror, that eye popping scene, a John Carlin tour de force, would become one of the most iconic in modern day Gothic horror. It also happens to be my very own lightning bolt introduction to the seductive and spooky realm of Dark Shadows, and that, my fellow devotees, is how I was first bitten. Now, most vampirologists will tell you there are three possible outcomes of going throat to fangs with the undead. The bloodsucker may a treat you like a cup of Maxwell House for you kiddies that's good to the last drop, whereupon you die and stay the way, or B, turn your car tide into a midnight buffet to be sipped on at leisure until you too become woolly unholy, or C, nibble just enough to keep you enslaved and hold you forever enraptured in their thrall. No question about it, old Willie and I were most definitely hard C's. To further mangle this metaphor, Dr. Julia Hoffman would later discover that the supernatural affliction transmitted from predator to prey was not unlike a virus. In my case, I was soon to learn that pre-existing conditions could intensify the infection's potency. At 8 years of age, I had already had at least one comorbidity, a love of ghost stories and all things Halloween. The first exposure to Dark Shadows ticked all my Monster Kid boxes and sealed my fate. I spent the entire summer break of 1967 in a delirious fever dream. With no school to run home from, my condition quickly became chronic. Come autumn, I was incurable. By the time I entered fourth grade at Brockett Elementary in Tucker, Georgia, I had already started a scrapbook dedicated to the show. I'd grabbed my mom's good scissors and cut out every article, review, advertisement, photo, and any other Dark Shadows what have yours I could get my tiny hands on. My sister's Tiger Beat magazines were reduced to Swiss cheese. I drew obsessive pictures of everything from the characters to the coffered drawing room doors of Collinwood. That winter I wrote a 6-page 16-act play neatly pecked on my dad's Royal typewriter, and convinced a very indulgent Miss Morris to allow me to produce, direct, and star. We played one performance to a packed classroom, and in the opera house of my imagination, 9-year-old Mark B. Perry was Barnabas Collins. Dark Shadows, based on the daytime serial adapted for the stage by Mark Perry, Act 1. Narrator: Dark were the shifting shadows that waxed and waned among the turrets and gables of the great house at Collinwood. Darker still were the shadows that deepened over the souls of those who dwelt within, shadows of fear and evil and despair. Soon after, in art class, I used cardboard to make a nifty miniature coffin with a teeny tiny plaque drawn on the lid bearing my name. Mrs. Johnson, a walking stereotype of the surface Southern school marm, paused by my desk and drawled, "Mark Perry, you are a morbid child. What a compliment." The six-sided coffin would turn out to be the inspiration for a full-size, traditional four-sided casket constructed from scrap lumber in my dad's basement workshop. I painted its plywood exterior flat back, an attached brass drawer pulls a pallbearer handles. I even fully lined the exterior with an old tufted pea green bedspread to make it extra comfy. To my delight, the finished product once spooked a hapless furnace repairman who had he known I was playing Barnabas Collins inside, might have hightailed it back up the stairs, three at a time, his hair turning chalk white as he flew. I'd have liked that. So devoted to Dark Shadows was I, that I'd hold the microphone of my parents' cassette recorder up to the TV speaker and record the episodes to play back again and again until the allowance busting cost of cassettes forced me to dub over them years ago. I found one such tape and relived the sounds of Barnabas chatting with some lovely but ill-fated night worker on the Collinsport docks. Then Bob Cobert's signature boom, bump, boom hammered home that thrilling moment when our hero reared his head back, exposed his maxillary cuspids, and got down to business on the recording. The music was then lost in the sound of the microphone being dropped as my child self not only squeaked but burst into applause, and still no one called Child Protective Services. I'm telling you, had a time traveler shown up from the future and given me a box containing every single episode, a box shaped like a coffin no less, I likely would never have been heard from again. I was fortunate in that my folks just shrugged it all off. Sure, maybe they would have preferred that their cape wearing kid emulate Superman and not a blood sucking serial killer, but they never once said boo about it. Instead, my resourceful mom soon figured out the best way to punish me or get me to do virtually anything was to threaten to take away my shadows, and that's why to this very day I'm still the best little boy in the world. So, in case you were wondering, those are my dark shadows bona fides, which brings us to what I believe to be the reason Patrick McRae honored me with his invitation to be his warm-up act. You see, Dan Curtis' brainchild was a major influence in setting me on my long voyage to Planet Grown Up, where I've settled in as a professional TV writer producer with more hours of broadcast episodes than I care to or probably even can recall. I'm also the guy who's crazy enough to be trying to reincarnate Dark Shadows as a sequel series, because as I say in my pitch, I'm determined to see the show restored to its rightful place in the pentathlon of great gothic horror television. As it turns out, that's at least one mission I share with the inestimable author of the pages to come. McCrae's quest to understand the show's magic was sparked not by mere fandom, but by something truly spiritual he can best explain himself. And just as I am driven to repair the disrespect and damage done to the show by a certain $150 million insult discourtesy of Mears, Burton, and Depp, so too is McCrae. I with Dark Shadow's reincarnation, and he with his vast catalog of works devoted to pop culture's quirkiest and most uniquely addictive phenomenon. Of course, he expresses this far more eloquently than when he writes of that ill advised film. The 2012 creative team didn't have the soul to show Dark Shadows featly or the wit to mine the genuine humor for its predicaments. Yeah, what he said, though I think creative team is just a way of being a gentleman. The show is not now and never was a campy vampire out of a coffin romp. Instead, as McCrae puts it with such eloquence, it's Shakespeare writing a Greek tragedy commissioned by Rod Serling, and that is the respectful perspective from which he waxes about all things Dark Shadows. The good, the bad, and the Leviathans, as I read McCrae's scholarity take on these episodes one by one, I realize that my Dark Shadows mania has always been childlike and blissful in its ignorance of the show's overarching themes and metaphors and dramatically nuances. I mean, I've always known the show was the coolest thing since The Twilight Zone. I just never knew how cool. Maybe because I never really stopped to think about it. As opposed to McCrae, who apparently can't stop thinking about it, and that's something for which we can all be quite thankful. Indeed, but you already know what or know that, or we wouldn't be all snug together here in these pages. But back to me for a moment. As established, I'm a lifelong fan of the show, but I never really embraced its fandom until these past few years, devolving the sequels shortly before I came out of the coffin and started to connect with other monomaniacs in the DS community. I took great pride in watching all 1,225 episodes. It took me a couple of years with a rather lengthy hiatus somewhere in the long Adam Frankenstein arc, but my mission was at least accomplished. Brief digression. 1. I wish I'd read McCrae's book before my rewatch. His thoughtfully word-smithered tribute to that storyline and Robert Rodin's portrayal of the creature not only opened my eyes, but pulled tears from them, damn it. While still in my pre-McCrae era ignorance on my own initiative, I thought I'd come up with the idea to start a new rewatch, but this time beginning with the 1795 origin storyline through to Victoria Winters being hanged as a witch, then jump back to episode 210 for the introduction of Barnabas Collins. I was intrigued that the character released in 1967, Collins bore little resemblance to the man he had once been and was destined to become again. I started to ponder what 172 years of sentient inhuman might do to an undead person's disproportion, how it might have turned the hopeless, romantic 18th century Barnabas into a 1960s satirical villain who ended every scene hand-wringing to some variation of insert character name, must die and soon. How clever, I thought, was ahem. Enter Patrick McRae. I don't recall exactly what combination of words I fed into Google that summoned him into my awareness, but once he arrived on the scene, I realized I'd been holding his beer without even knowing it. Of course, he'd already done the 1795 rewatch jump back to 1967 thing, and the only face-saving consolation for me was that our theories explaining Barbas' catatonic mood swing more or less jibbed. At least I felt somewhat validated. And then there's the ultimate beer haul. A full decade earlier, he had famously watched all 1,225 episodes, only he did it in 45 days, just calculating the daily hours involved in what undertaking is beyond my mathematics. The very thought of such an endeavor conjures image of Malcolm McDowell's eyes pinned wide aversion therapy treatments in Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. So I think it's pretty safe to say McCrae pioneered, if not outright invented, the binge watch before it had a name, and he did so that the ultimate bender. Is there any other single series with more produced episodes available on DVD or streaming? I think not, and he emerged from the sensory overload chamber with some pretty darn profound insights into the show we all love. Let me put it this way, if Dark Shadows were a language, I could speak and understand it well enough to get a taxi or order a burger at the Collinsport Inn without humiliating myself. Whereas McCrae, who achieved his fluency through the total immersion method, would be holding court at the Blue Whale surrounded by every Sam, Carolyn, and Harry in town, cracking wise and making them all laugh until they were hyperventilating. Which brings me to a point I've been anxious to get to while having so much tangential fun, though those of us in the DS universe often hear that Dan Curtis and his team would sometimes ignore plot inconsistencies in production bloopers because they were pretty sure nobody would ever see the episodes again, let alone rewatch the entirety of their work in order. More so to their way of thinking, who in their right mind would want to? Digression 2. If that were true, one has to wonder why Curtis saved all the tapes, but that's a discussion for another time. Now, I've been in many a writer's room, and I've also been a showrunner on more than one TV series. In those 30 plus years, my experience producing just 22 or more 45-minute little movies in 10 months is a hair on fire exercise. Remember that I Love Lucy episode where Lucy and Ethel get jobs in a chocolate factory where they're working the assembly line and it rapidly goes from easy peasy to chaotic hilarity? Well, then, my friends, is exactly what it's like to produce a TV series. Only you have to replace hilarity with blind panic. With blind panic. It's a relentless conveyor belt of breaking story, writing studio notes, rewriting network notes, more rewriting director meetings, casting sessions, still more rewriting, more meetings, pre production, production, and then trying to fix it all in post. And the conveyor belt never slows or stops until the season order is completed. Now try to imagine an overlapping conveyor belt where you're doing all of the above while simultaneously in pre, pro, and post on several other little boxes of chocolates. Only this time, the season order has no end in sight. It's not just multitasking, it's omnitasking. And like Lucy's Chocolate Factory, some of your darlings will come out perfect, and a few will be a little beat up. A handful you'll eat, and the rest you'll stuff down your pants. With that in mind, this TV veteran has to confess I cannot wrap my remaining remaining brain cells around how the writers of Dark Shadows produced 5 episodes a week, 52 weeks a year, without a single rerun, and only 5 preemptions from 1966 to 1971. I mean, their conveyor belt must have been a Clive Barker esque steampunk version of Lucy's, and despite that, they somehow managed to produce, as McCrae is fond of saying, one complete, epic, and satisfying story. Honestly, it's hard for me to imagine anyone having that time to put a tenth of the thought into creating their work, as McCrae puts it into his analysis of it. The original writers even admitted they sometimes got so lost in their own tangled web that they'd have to ask the school kids categorized outside the studio for clarification. So the big question for me is, where were they aware of all the resonation subtleties and eloquent callbacks and character nuances, or the blend of comedy and pathos that McCrae so art, artfully unearths in their story conferences at each other's Manhattan homes, where they create their flimsy scene by scene episode, beat sheets working from Sam Hall and or Gordon Russell's master plan. Were they spinning all that gold on the fly? One of these talents, Violet Wells, recalled an interview that they also spent a lot of time on the phone laughing hysterically as they tried to recall if Quentin was alive or dead that week, or had he what who had done what to whom in 1840. In the center of their daily maelstrom like grind, were they hiding all those fabric Easter eggs that McCrae has found in his archaeological dig, or were they just sprinting to make sure ABC didn't go dark at 4 o'clock every weekday afternoon, all the while chanting their mantra, "It's okay because no one will ever see our work again"? After reading what lies just a page flip away, McCrae's brilliant, insightful, and often laugh out loud blend of reverence and its more mischievous alter ego, I think we can safely conclude the Dark Shadows writers may not have always known exactly what they were doing, but they were all so whip smart literate that they did it anyway by second nature, part damn good craftspersonship, part happenstance, but one takeaway from McRae's analysis is that you can't have those happy accidents if you're not already on the right path. He makes a masterful case that's not retrofitting excellence. He's already baked into the show's DNA, whether intentional or as a result of a collective savant like genius among Dan Curtis and his scribe. And we're all very fortunate indeed to have Patrick McRae, Mr. Dark Shadows himself, to sort it all out for the rest of us. Now get out of here and go binge this book. If you're like me, you'll be bitten all over again. Mark B. Perry was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and earned his BA in broadcast journalism from the University of Georgia. An inspired writer and filmmaker, he moved to Los Angeles in 1986 and worked as an office temp until he wrote a script on spec for the top 10 show, The Wonder Years. Not only did this writing sample lead to a freelance assignment and a staff position on the series, he was also purchased and produced as the opening episode of the 1989-1990 season entitled Summer Song. Its premiere was the number 3 show for that week in the Nielsen ratings, outranked by The Vulnerable Roseanne and The Cosby Show. Mark went on to write and produce such diverse television series as Northern Exposure, Picket Fences, Moon Over Miami, Law and Order, Party of Five, Push, Time of Your Life, Pasadena, Five First Years, That Was Then, One Tree Hill, Windfall, and What About Brian? After helping successfully launch the second season of ABC's Brothers and Sisters in 2007, Mark was then a co-executive producer on CBS's Ghost Whisperer. Finally, in 2011, Mark began 2 gloriously venomous seasons on the ABC hit Revenge before resigning to complete his debut novel City of Horrors as a producer on the first season on David E. Kelly's Picket Fences. Mark and the other producers received an Emmy Award for Outstanding Dramatic Series. For his episode of Party in 5 entitled Falsies, he was nominated for a Writers Guild of America Award for Best Achievement in Dramatic Writing, which was 1997, by the way. And for his writing and producing services on that same series, he shared a Golden Globe Award for Best Drama in 1996. He is also known to fans of Dark Shadows as the creator slash executive producer of Dark Shadows Reincarnation. A forwarded conclusion. Take 1,225 steps back. Look at the whole series. What's the story? When Barnabas appears in 1967, we think he only wants one thing, Josette. But that's not who he wants. She loved him for what he represented. Rather, he wants his sister Sarah, who loved him for who he was. Maybe is when she finally appears to Barnabas, she castigates him for his newfound reliance on forced brutality, the terror. He must be good, she tells him. Only when he is will she appear again. The currency of human interaction is trust, and trust is a myth that only exists until we screw up. Some people pride themselves in never screwing up. That must be nice for the rest of us. Transgressions identify us far more than our triumphs, and then it becomes the job of stories to clean up the emotional mess that results. Separation sins from sinners is anathema To us, look at our news. We thrive on real life exposes of supposedly good people revealed to be the worst of us all. Mistrust is a fundamental human survival skill. So those moments of revelation justify our fears, while mistrust, especially of that self and our own character, might help us survive. It does not help us evolve. Its road it's a road that leads to safety, not happiness, not joy, and ultimately not love. It's a choice that keeps us literally in the dark shadows. In the move Magnolia, we are asked, what can we forgive? Well, what is the basis for forgiveness? Forgiveness is an act of faith. It's a statement that just because someone has done something fundamentally bad, it does not allow that they are fundamentally bad simultaneously doing good deeds does not make you a good person. The ultimate definition act of a good person is the choice to recognize the goodness and worth in another human, commonly when they don't expect it. Barnabas makes a mistake. He uses someone without owning their humanity of his own. He treats Angelique as a commodity. He treats Josette that way too. She's a, a means to a business end. And why should he not treat either woman that way? That's how he treats himself. That's how that's how his family treats him. It's literally no way to live as a vampire. He stands outside of the social world where they treated him like a prop and encouraged him to treat others like props until he doesn't. After a fashion, he finds purpose in doing good deeds, first as a human reborn, but even more as a vampire, but a vampire by choice. And we think he's mastered that at the end of 1897. The reward, he becomes a human again for the second, arguably third time. He's learned his lesson and all's right with the world. So what's up with him becoming evil again with the Leviathans? I'm not talking about the literal truth of the storytelling mechanics. He wasn't privy to the story sessions. I'm talking about the metaphorical truth of someone who is ignorant of those show building realities. His second fall is as much a metaphor as anything. It's a signal that the story isn't over. It's because he still has not forgiven himself. He's congregated his cleverness, but he cannot surmount the challenge of ignoring his heart, his deafening pride, and the damage it has done because Angelique remains. And how can he atone? What's on the other side of the action? Is there even a person left under the eleemosynary patina of saving Collinwood? It's only in 1840, after having lost everything again on every grander scales, that he can craft the only kindness that was really necessary. He forgives Angelique, and he even does so while acknowledging his lasting prejudice. Her acts are unforgivable, but so are his, and the two of them just keep living anyway. So atoning with deed for deed only does so much. It doesn't bring back the dead, and it doesn't soothe the hearts of those who survived them, because the only ones to survive them are eventually Barnabas and Angelique. And here we come to the point when Sarah finally speaks to him hundreds of episodes before. She tells him that he must be good. Barnabas interprets this as a doing good, and like a good superhero, that's what he does. But if you ask regarding Angelique how a fundamentally good person would relate to her, he would probably say, "Forgive her," but I can't do that. Ergo, it makes me a bad person. Of course, that's not true. In the end, faced with, faced with an evil that has taken seemingly the only things left that matter to him, he commits the one act that is not an act. It's a statement of who he is. He lets himself love. He is what Sarah admonished him to be. He is good. He always was, and he remains good. So we hope, even after fate's ultimate test, taking his inspiration, Angelique, away, of course. The real challenge is not for Barnabas, it is for us. We've seen him recognize that he is good. Can we see that in ourselves? Patrick McCrae. But a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Andrea del Sarto, Robert Browning. I can do anything. I'm the chief of police. Martin Brody, Amity Island, July 1975. Part 1, Departure. Let me see where my guys. Okay. 1795, Call to Adventure. Night has fallen over the great house of Collinwood, and a beginning is a very delicate time. Miss Erland, especially 365 episodes in. Barnabas was never intended to be a hero, and we can learn volumes about the evolution of a TV show by studying his journey to heroism. Ratings hit, can't kill him, kids love him anyway, what to do? And there are those who see the later Barnabas as a betrayal of his initial persona. But that's just one perspective. When Dark Shadows is contemplated as a finished work with its own goofy, lovable internal consistency, Barnabas was always the hero, even while we awaited his liberation. He just had a bad wake up call after an involuntary entombment of many, many decades. Who among us is truly human before the first shisha, the heralds, the morning? Exactly. After 1795 reveals his origin, it's hard to view him quite so ominously. In fact, the most helpful thing for me is to go back and watch those first episodes with his storyline in mind. But who has time for that? I got 2 shows in Vegas tonight. So let's get this straightened out. The faster and more fascinating approach to Dark Shadows is to begin in 1795. See who Barnabas is, or was, or will be, and then unchain him. It adds poignancy to his fall from humanity and gives us a point of aspiration. Episode 367. Vicky's impromptu trip to 1795 might end with religious fundamentalists setting her clothes on fire, but her troubles are just beginning. Abigail Collins, Clarice Blackburn. Abigail awakens Victoria with the news that the young time traveler is probably just an agent of Satan. The time traveler then visits an unfinished Collinwood and meets the dashing Jeremiah. Despite Abigail's misgivings, the family hires her on as young Sarah's tutor. Victoria has a bright future, 175 years in the past. 367 is an episode that holds a strange magic. Victoria is in 1795, and instead of just and being carted off to her room, actually takes action exploring the world and carving a little place in it. She even challenges Abigail on the insanity of her religious fascism in the space of 22 minutes. Victoria shows more gumption, drive, and nerve than she's probably displayed in the entire series, and finally earns legitimate recognition as the heroine of the show, since Barnabas will spend months as someone tenement to a hapless victim. It's not officially a hapless victim. Victoria becomes the lead, where we've been hoping to see for the past 16 months. The prior episode, which introduces Victoria to 1795, is even more magical, but it is so surreal and intoxicating that it feels like the dream of which Vicky mistakes it. In 367, we awaken from the dream, as does Victoria, and we find that it's still real. Brazenly so. From the start of 367, the show is off to the races. 366, Jonathan Frid trying a bit too hard to be the blue boy come to life, playing a wide-eyed innocence that is incomparable with his mordant Canadian wit. An episode or two in, and Fred will be in his element. The only one in 367 who seems as ill at ease is Anthony George, and it never seems to take from him. Contrast this with Clarice Blackburn, who finally has a part worthy of her potently and acerbic talent. She's like a bitter, hypocritical wives in the domestic W.C. Fields movies, and she will find a way to keep that shtick fresh until Barnabas does her in, months from now. Of course, Joan Bennett is finally playing to her strengths and reads as if she walked right off the set of Man in the Iron Mask. All of these lends a touch of MGM grandeur to the proceedings. Most of all, Louis Edmonds is completely transformed as Joshua. It's the toughest role in the storyline to play. It requires him to be a stiff, unwielding representative of double standard while still having a compassionate heart buried deep somewhere. His take on the job interview with Victoria lacks a script as funny as the one that will be perfected for the 1990 series, but the strange mixture of fairness and frugality it makes for great TV. See where it was. Likewise, Leela Swift is composing shots and using lighting with a creativity and sense of art far beyond what we usually expect from hurriedly assembled daytime soap operas. There's a unique thrill for Dark Shadows fans in seeing Collinwood still under construction and the early morning sun with which it is lit gives an old set a brand spanking new aura, aura back at the not yet old house, in the scene where the family is considering whether or not to take on Victoria. Swift paints one meaningful screen picture after another. She lines up the characters for most skeptical to least, often balancing the screen picture with them. These are small touches completely unnecessary for the practical job, but they have a sense of art. This is clearly inspired by the unique nature of the episode and incredibly complicated set of given circumstances is communicated with economy and panache. 1795 is a storyline that is much more about the mixed blessing necessity of compromises as it is about anything. Barnabas compromises with Angelique. Hell, the entire family compromises with Abigail until it's too late. But we also see Victoria compromise with Joshua and her own sense of honor as she lies her way into survival, a new skill for the unusually honorable governess. She spent a year and a half as the measure of purity against which we judge the dirty hands of her fellow characters. Now seeing life in a true survival mode, shall finally gain the skills and make the choices to ultimately understand and figure out how to play the Glavachord. This episode hit the airwaves November 21st, 1967, episode 368/369. When Barnabas is reintroduced to Angelique, can he resist her temptation to stray from Josette, or will the charming chambermaid distract him with an unforgettable new direction? Angelique, Laura Parker. Barnabas is elated to find that Josette has arrived. However, when the news comes from Angelique, his old flame, he is reminded that his fidelity is precarious. Angelique does what she can to persuade him to stray, and his refusal to do so is a clear in- invitation to the dance for the sorceress. One of my favorite cliches in the Daybook is about this being the official first episode of the series. Another one is this is the perfect place to introduce someone to the series. Far be it to me to let you down, this episode does both. In the previous few episodes, we are just dealing with temporal jet lag and the thrill and shock of seeing the show take on the wild ambition of 1795. The installments are certainly necessary for flavor, but when it comes to advancing the plot, this episode is all meat. Has has always to find the beginning of a story, study the ending, and work backward. In fact, this is the core of David Bale's backwards and forwards play reading technique. When you read a play backward, the context of the entire script is brought into crystal clarity. You begin by seeing the final, deciding choice made by the characters, the choice that sums up the entire story. By then, the only choice possible, the rest of the plot is about exploring how all other alternatives fell away until you reach the beginning of the play, when everything was and should be possible. Just as Dark Shadows has one or more beginning, it has at least two endings. One at the end of 1840 and one at the end of 1841 parallel time. And both of those endings have a single thing in common. Jonathan Frid and Laura Parker aren't in each other's arms. Seen this way, this show is about getting them there. After 7 months of hearing about Angelique today, she enters, so no pressure, Laura. You only have to live up to half a year of a build-up. No portrait, no ghost, no voice at a seance to tease the audience with your laughter. Nothing but Jonathan Frid and language. Oh, and she is entering as the first new female character to greet the ensemble in a year or so since Dana Malay. Yes, I realized that I left out Grayson Hall. I read that as a testament to the strange gender neutrality of the pair, and this is what I mean. Julia is not a creature bound by the tropes and cliches typically used as shorthand to represent the standard TV woman. of the era. Yet Malay is swathed in those tropes, and she entered into a tight ensemble of women, each of whom had a distinct identity and place in the storytelling. And I know it's just me, but she never really fit. I mean, she was fine as flame fingering fire spirit woman go, but Malay kind of feels like an intruder into the pre-established chemistry of the show and its alignments that benefits the storytelling. With that as the only basis of comparison, Laura Parker gets to work given the results. I imagine that the last words as a stagehand heard from her being she made her first appearance were, "Think that's all a tall order, hold my decree, decree," as an invisible timpani began its roll. Is she nervous? Is she confident? It doesn't matter. The moment the camera records her, she transforms the program with a beautiful sense of truth, intelligence, etruism, and dark integrity that feel absolutely real and wholly unique in television. The casting of Laura Parker was the single most important decision Dan Curtis ever made. Not to slight Jonathan Frid, but his job was made easier than you might think by the costume and the lyrical writing, the props, the old house set, and the fact that he is playing a vampire. But who made the badass a badass? This challenge is far more sophisticated and Laura Parker had no fangs. At this point, her costume had to represent 18th century refinement with a dishwater lack of glamour. Did she get an Inverness cape? Did she get a cool ring and nifty cane? No, she got a handkerchief and Jeffersonian G.I. Joe. All the power that she mustered had to come from within. And although she manifests so much abilities in this episode, the potential energy is clearly there. I think that's true for viewers, even if they somehow miss the context laid out in the conversation over 1967. Now we know why Barnabas became what he will be and with that, in love with this woman and her unique mix of capable strength, diplomacy, and emotional honesty. With that established, there's at least a plot at the stick of this plane. That build up actually meant something. The program has an actor who can make us believe that we are witnessing history rather than reenactment. The episode works in every regard, showing us a world of hypocrisy destined to fall. This is prior to countless little after images, after images of disaster and triumph. We see all of the assumptions that will create the controlled demolition of Collinwood before it even enjoys its grand opening raffle. This begins with Joshua's dismissal of love as fit only for women, not men. This should, this should, according to him, be a world of sensible arranged marriages designed only to enhance commerce. Take that conflicted thinking wrap in it the alluring regularity of Catherine Lee Scott, and it's easy to see the rationalizations that led to Barnabas's downfall. His continued pursuit of Josette nearly 2 centuries later isn't love, it is his desire to earn his father's approval by projecting a very specific type of masculinity. He just happens to be a great romantic anyway. So he will do his best to merge his natural inclinations with a strategy to keep Joshua off his back. Thanks to Jonathan Frid's natural disinclination toward the erotic, his immediate and conflicted attraction to Angelique reads as far more personal than simple-minded. Prayer prism, prayer prism. When Barnabas loves, it's clear that he's responding to a woman's deepest essence. It's no wonder that Angelique responds as she does. Rejecting her is an act of brave determination, one commensurate with the brave determination shown by her. The pursuit of Barnabas forces her to hide her powers even longer. Not easily done, as she risks everything to return home via sea voyage in the most inclement weather of the year. What makes it worth it, Angelique could have anyone, but Barnabas is hardly just anyone, as she has the right number. Say what you will, Angelique is not a stalker. Deluded into thinking that Barnabas is something he is not, Angelique doesn't just get the memo, she binds them with the Library of Congress, forgetting nothing if Victoria exists to find every new things to not understand. Angelique resides as the opposite end of the spectrum. Her willingness to fight for the love is made all the more admirable when we contrast her with the shallow and arrogant Countess Natalie, easily pleased with her title and the cruel privileges that it makes possible. When we meet Naomi here, day drinking to distract herself from Joshua's world, we glimpse an even darker surrender. It is a surrender of greatness that makes Angelique's determination even more astonishing. She understands exactly what she will be fighting for eventually in 1840. She will take a bullet for that belief, and she will finally die, but it will be on her own terms, having proved Barnabas's love and the worthiness of her own character. It begins now. The episode hit the airwaves November 22nd, 1967. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop right there and I'll pick this up tomorrow, some more of this up tomorrow. Um, if you have not picked up the Dark Shadows Daybook Unbound, go pick it up. It'll be in the description box. I read the introduction and I am at location 350. That's where I'm at on my read. So, hope you guys enjoy this.